Good day and welcome to Nature's Returns, a webinar speaker series hosted by the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. My name is Charlie Governale, and I will be your host for today's webinar, which is titled New Financing for Our Declining City Forests, Bringing to Market Carbon Credits and Impact Certification at a National Scale. The Nature's Returns webinar series invites leading practitioners and researchers in the field of conservation finance to talk about the latest opportunities and developments in the growing field of ecosystem service valuation and investment. Today, we will be exploring the topic of financing for city parks and trees. Urban trees and forests are often overlooked in our fight against climate change, and yet they cumulatively represent a significant carbon sink. More than that, they provide a wide array of co-benefits to our urban communities that are far more tangible than the benefits provided by far-off wilderness areas. However, the numbers show that our urban tree canopy is under siege in the US, and new financing mechanisms are urgently needed. Today, we will be engaging with Mark McPherson, the Executive Director of City Forest Credits, as he walks us through promising new solutions for the urban tree canopy crisis. Before we begin, we would like to remind our listeners that we welcome any questions you might have. Please type those questions directly into the Q&A window. The chat window is also okay, but the Q&A window is preferred. At any point throughout the presentation, we welcome them. We will aggregate those questions and share them with Mark at the end of his talk. We have approximately 20 minutes planned as a Q&A session after the presentation, so please stick around to hear responses to your questions. To open our webinar, I'd like to introduce Mark. Mark brings many years of experience in law, business, and nonprofit work in urban forestry. He served on a carbon protocol drafting group at the Climate Action Reserve in 2013, and he is now the Executive Director of City Forest Credits, a nonprofit based in Seattle and working nationally. Mark, welcome to Nature's Returns. Let me turn it over to you now.
All right, thank you very much, Charlie. And thanks to all of you for signing in. Charlie told me that you all come from a diverse array of backgrounds and interests and institutions and organizations, and he encouraged me to give a robust presentation. So I've put together what I hope will be a highly nutritious midday meal for you, intellectual meal. Maybe not a feast, but a good solid midday meal to get you through the rest of the day. So I'm going to start with some fun and maybe not so fun facts about urban forestry, and then move on to a couple main courses that will be protein rich. Those are what I would call nonprofit entrepreneurship. And also the second one, how does this look on the ground? And then of course you have to have your vegetables. So we'll talk a little bit about the quantification of both the carbon and the co-benefits, as well as other benefits and impacts such as equity and health. And then we'll take a quick look at the scale and the possibilities ahead and end with a cordial. And you all may know that a cordial is a term often used to describe an after-meal drink. It comes from the root for the word heart. And so I'd like to connect at the very end with a little bit of heart. All right, so as Charlie said, yes, urban forests are under siege. The tree loss is 35 million trees per year. It's 175,000 acres per year. This was documented in a paper published in 2018 by Dave Nowak, who's a prominent urban forest research scientist. His study period was 2009 to 2014, so that was the most recent data. And that 175,000 acres per year, if you sum that up over the 5 years of the study period, that land area equals the land area of all of those cities combined. Now, you don't walk into Boston and see a city that's clear-cut. Tree loss in urban areas is much more insidious because it's often death by 1,000 cuts. And those of you who live in cities and who walk through cities may notice some of the loss, whether it's from lack of adequate maintenance funding, whether it's infill development, whether it's conversion of small forested parcels into platted subdivisions, the tree loss is substantial. And these are all things you know. The last bullet here is something that you may not know, which is we are projected to add urban land area the size of Montana by 2060. So that is just under 100 million acres of land that will be added to our urban areas. And this, of course, presents a tremendous challenge and a tremendous opportunity because a lot of the annexation of land to urban areas has resulted in essentially low density development. So those areas are often converted into impervious surface, whether it's roads, rooftops, parking lots. So when we have the opportunity to add urban land area of that size, there's a significant opportunity, if we can plan for that, to preserve significant forested stands that become integrated into those additional urban areas. So I call this walls and canopies. You all know about walls. You know, the Corps of Engineers proposed a retractable gate at the mouth of the New York Harbor, just one example. That's apparently been withdrawn, but nonetheless, there's conversation about huge berms in lower Manhattan, seawalls to protect it. And those things, I mean, those are all possibly legitimate efforts to protect cities like New York. And of course, those same conversations are going on in Venice, in the Netherlands, Bangkok. You know, it's a significant issue. But walls around us is one thing. We may want to think about canopies over our heads because cities are losing trees right when they need them the most. And it's just documented heat-related deaths exceed hurricanes, tornadoes, and lightning. And trees provide all these other benefits. This is just a short list of the stormwater, air quality, energy savings from the heating and cooling effects, bird, pollinator, wildlife habitat, slope stability, and more prominent in the mind of scientists, and I think increasingly in the minds of urbanists, the social equity and the human health benefits. And one thing that we frequently encounter in our work, particularly among people who aren't familiar with urban forestry, is, well, but the cities, they fund their trees, right? They love their trees. And yes, everybody loves the trees. And I've come to the conclusion that it's really the math. It's the accounting. Because the trees on municipal budgets are booked as an expense. They're a liability expense and they're a maintenance expense. They are not, there is no accounting metric now currently that puts trees as an asset on the balance sheet. And as you know, there are efforts now to move natural capital onto the balance sheets of all kinds of entities, from cities, states, counties, to companies. But it is not there yet. So at the end of the year, when the budget managers in cities are looking at their books, the trees are an expense. And when cities are stretched, as they are now and as they will be in light of COVID-19, with all of the many, many dire human service, utility, public safety, transit, home, affordable housing needs, the trees always fall to the bottom of that list. The second challenge that urban forestry has is that it has traditionally, its services have been delivered locally. And that's a strength in some ways because the local urban forest people, they know their climate, they know their communities, they know their species, they know their stakeholders. But the downside is urban forestry has no national presence or voice. And that is something that has really held urban forestry back from getting adequate funding and getting the kind of energy and dynamism that's going to be needed to keep our cities canopied. So addressing the problem really is what the economists might describe as the free rider problem, which is there are many beneficiaries of the urban forest. And the urban forests are, whether the trunks grow on private property or not, they are essentially a public resource because the canopy is interwoven in the air, and that canopy provides tremendous public resource benefits. And trees, in fact, are infrastructure. And I'll show you some slides about that in a little bit. But the trees are really such miraculous creatures that the notion of building walls, that's fine. Humans have loved to build things. Civil engineers love to build things. But the tree itself is a miraculous organism. And if it did not exist, we would invent it to do what it does. But it's right here. It's right in front of us, all too often taken for granted. But it is infrastructure. So I think the future of addressing urban forest issues, and this is not the primary purpose of my presentation to you today, but the future is to identify the beneficiaries of the urban forest. And those can be healthcare companies, hospitals who benefit from the human health benefits. It could be all the many people, organizations, governmental entities that benefit from the stormwater reductions. Identify all the many beneficiaries and either make them or incentivize them to pay for that. And you see work like this done in the forest context with Blue Forest. I think they made a presentation on this forum, Quantified Ventures and Forest Resiliency Bonds. Many of those are efforts to really identify who's getting the benefits of a natural climate solution and how do you incentivize them to pay. In our case, though, we thought, we can't solve that problem right now. Let's take the straightest line to the shortest distance. How do we get private sector funding into urban forestry, and how do we do it now, not 5-10 years from now? And we knew one thing: we didn't have to create the carbon market. That's out there. We thought, can we add a new project type to this existing market? And so now I'm starting to talk about nonprofit entrepreneurship, which is, are there opportunities out there? And I don't know that I would call this arbitrage. I would call this more, can a new organization that understands urban forestry and understands carbon, can it simply add a new project type to this existing market and create a compelling case for investment in that project type? So again, on the topic of nonprofit entrepreneurship, we needed to raise funding. We knew we wanted to be nonprofit. The 3 large carbon registries are nonprofit. We intended to be a carbon registry for urban forestry. In other words, a dedicated, almost boutique registry devoted to one sector of carbon, which is urban forest carbon. So we knew we wanted to be nonprofit. That meant we needed to raise foundation money to get started. And there's a whole nother webinar on how to raise money from foundations. I've spent my whole career in Seattle, so I was able to get introductions to foundations in Seattle, which then gradually led to introductions at other places. And what I found is 2 things. One, there's a tremendous interest in cities now, a recognition that cities can't be done the way they have been done going forward. So we need to think about how to make cities greener, more livable, smarter, more sustainable, more attractive, more efficient, in every possible way. I also learned, and this is maybe a parenthetical, that navigating the foundation world and particularly gaining entry reminded me a little bit of almost a medieval landscape, with the foundations being like feudal castles. And by feudal, I mean F-E-U-D-A-L, not F-U-T-I-L-E. Although there are times I wondered about the futility, because those foundations are often built with very wide moats and very thick doors, and they have very many gatekeepers. So again, this is another topic for another day, but very interesting how to raise money and how to then use some of those connections you've made to get contacts with other foundations. So again, on the nonprofit entrepreneurship, I just thought you might be interested. Advice I received along the way: you'll never get enough volume, Mark, in urban forest carbon. You're never going to have enough scale. The big carbon registries won't do it. City agencies aren't innovators. Elected officials aren't innovators. They've got a short-term time horizon. Local nonprofits aren't innovators. Prices are going to be too high. Prices are going to be too low. You'll never raise the funding. You've got to be in distressed cities. Forget about cities like Seattle and Austin. Trees are amenities there. You need to be in distressed cities. Other people saying you'll never get projects done in distressed cities because they don't have the resources. You have to start in the affluent cities. You need to scale this fast. No, you need to go very slowly and very carefully to demonstrate success and build credibility. And any of you who have tried to create something new, this will look familiar to you. And if you intend to create something new, you should probably prepare yourself for this kind of conflicting advice. So here's some key strategic decisions we made. Yes, 501c3, I made it very clear to our inner stakeholder group that we should make no mistake, we are developing a product and we have to take that product to market. And we can do work to advance urban forestry, but our primary mission is to articulate that product to develop it, and then find a way to make that product attractive to the market. We did know that the volumes of city forest carbon would be low. They're not as low as people might think, because we're talking about much more than planting a few hundred street trees. But we knew that compared to some of the gigantic forest projects where they're locking up 50,000 acres of forest land in Indonesia, we knew the volumes would be low. We also knew that the prices must be high because urban land is expensive, urban trees are expensive. If we can't command a high price for the urban forest carbon, then there will not be sufficient incentive for cities and local nonprofit tree organizations to do the projects. So we determined pretty early on that what we are trying to do is create a specialty carbon product. It's rare and it's extremely valuable. We have kind of likened the urban forest carbon credit to a rare earth mineral, highly valuable, but low volume. And one of the very first things that we did was talk to our scientists to say, look, you guys are urban forest scientists. You know all the many benefits of urban trees. Can we build those other benefits into a carbon credit? And as you all probably know, a carbon credit represents a metric ton of CO2. And the scientists went back, did their science, and came and said, you know what, we can include with a metric ton of CO2 quantified stormwater in the form of rainfall interception in the canopy, air quality, and energy savings, which is kilowatt hours and BTUs from heating and cooling benefits, with a metric ton of CO2. So now we have what, I hesitate to make this claim, but it may be the only credit, it's the only credit I'm aware of that actually includes these quantified co-benefits, ecosystem benefits with the metric ton of CO2. And that's why we call it Carbon Plus. So what else makes this special? Well, it's where the people are. And the large carbon registries, they've done incredible work. They've stored millions of tons of carbon, or I should say projects under their protocols and registries have stored millions of tons of carbon. And in many ways, what they did made perfect sense, and it's what should have been done first, which is to build markets, build registries that almost emulate the financial markets, where you are trying to make the purchase and sale of carbon as frictionless as possible. The one thing that's left out of that, though, is the story, because transacting carbon then becomes just an accounting transaction. And I've talked to so many people now, companies, who have said, yeah, we have bought carbon, we like buying carbon, we feel like it's important, but you know, it's just kind of an accounting transaction on the books. And so those projects often don't tell a story. And the large carbon projects that do tell a story, those are what are known as charismatic projects. Microsoft, for example, bought some forest credits from Indonesia that also preserved orangutan habitat. That's the project that they feature on their social media and their annual reports, because it has a story. Well, trees and cities are where people are, and people are customers, they're employees, they're voters, and where people are, there are communities, and where there are communities, there are stories. So that locally sourced credit with a story is a very significant part of our product. The last bullet on this page uses a little bit of jargon, but it's absolutely true. I think urban forest carbon is probably the only carbon that will deliver that global atmospheric benefit of the carbon storage with local mitigation resiliency benefits through all of those ecosystem co-benefits. And by that, I mean the stormwater, the air quality, the energy savings, the health and equity benefits, because as we know, the vulnerable populations will feel the consequences of global warming first. So I'm going to pause there. Charlie, did you want to interject something?
Yeah, just thank you, Mark. I just wanted to say that for any of you who are just joining us in the audience, we're here with Mark McPherson, the Executive Director of City Forest Credits, as he walks us through new solutions for the urban tree canopy crisis, as well as his own experience getting a new nonprofit off the ground to tackle this. We'll be moving forward into discussions of particular project examples, quantification, and several other topics. Thank you again for all joining us today. Mark, let me turn it back over to you.
Okay, great. So how did we roll this out? We decided we definitely do not want to develop carbon protocols here in the lab, if you will, and I mean that in a metaphorical sense, because we had a lot of experience with carbon protocols on our protocol drafting group, but we felt like it was really important to road test these protocols in places that were highly motivated to do it, where we could show how this could work. We wanted to do that carefully and thoroughly before we start announcing something that maybe we couldn't deliver in the way we expected. So I wouldn't say we recruited, but we found the right people who wanted to do this. And there's just not time today to talk about all of these, so I'm just going to mention a few. Austin, Texas is a primary example. Their climate program manager connected with us very early on and has been very active and very invested in what we're doing. And one of the reasons is the city of Austin has a very proactive carbon reduction goal. And the city of Austin has been and is buying carbon credits, and they buy them on the big registries. And but what they really want to do, because this is taxpayer dollars, they really want locally sourced credits, because they want their credit dollars, their taxpayer dollars, to be delivered in local benefits and to have the dollars stay in the local economy. So they have been, they've just been very supportive, very invested in this. They said that they tried on their own about 8-9 years ago to kind of do their own protocol, their own mechanism to quantify and credit this, but they just did not have the science. They didn't have the capacity to do that. And I think they also recognized that a very regional program at that time is probably not going to work. You need something that's got more credibility and more heft. You really need a national standard and a national program. And again, this is lessons learned. The climate program manager was a strong champion of this. He had the power and the motivation to get all of the urban forest people together in Austin to say, okay, how are we going to do this? And the city will buy the credits, but who is going to do the projects? Who's going to comply with the carbon protocols? Who's going to actually generate the supply of credits? And to make a very long story short, it turned out that the local nonprofit tree organization there said, we have a particular expertise in riparian reforestation. And water is a very significant issue in Central Texas, water quantity, water quality. The city has a very sophisticated and capable watersheds department. And so the watersheds people and the nonprofit and the climate people all work together to say, let's launch a riparian reforestation carbon program. So that's, again, that's an example of urban forestry working at its best, where they know their local community, they know the challenges, they know it needs to be addressed, and they can bring together the stakeholders who can make that happen. I'll talk just about King County and then Des Moines real quick. King County has a land conservation initiative underway. It is trying to preserve the last remaining open spaces in the county, of which there are over 60,000 acres. And the county is sophisticated. They have mapped all of the parcels that they want to acquire, a lot of which are in rural, almost wildland areas, you would say, because King County is very big. It runs from Puget Sound all the way to the Cascades. But they've also mapped all the areas that are in metropolitan areas or in urban areas. And so King County launched, I believe, the first local government forest carbon program last May. And it has both a rural carbon part to it, and they're working with us on the city forest carbon part. And I mentioned King County partly because these are preservation projects, whereas Austin is a planting project. And we developed two protocols, one obviously a planting protocol. The preservation protocol is modeled after an avoided conversion or avoided emission protocol in forestry. So essentially you credit parcels where the trees are at some risk, and if the trees are preserved, then you can credit the biomass and the carbon in those trees. So that's a King County program. The buyer in that case was a local fishing company. They had 3 vessels fishing in the Bering Sea, but they were headquartered here in the Seattle area. They were woman-owned, and they had just commissioned the first green fishing vessel in the Bering Sea. All new learning for me and for my team here. I did not know that the fishing industry in the Bering Sea is essentially running a bunch of gas-guzzling vessels out there because there are no emissions controls on the Bering Sea fishery. So this organization, you know, they're privately held. They were able to make the business case for a highly energy efficient vessel, as well as the environmental case. And they really wanted to purchase credits to start taking that vessel to carbon neutrality. And they wanted, again, locally sourced credits. So in that case, they found us. I referred them to King County. King County sold the first credits to that company. The third one I'll mention is in Des Moines, Iowa, and that's a very different kind of buyer. This is Microsoft. You all probably know that Microsoft has a very sophisticated carbon program. They just announced they're going carbon negative, and they're incredibly capable. They're way ahead of the curve on carbon. They have also, in the last 5 years, seen an explosion of their cloud product. And the cloud product requires data centers. Data centers have to be located places. So Microsoft now is in the unusual position of finding itself with facilities in cities and towns all over the world. And the group that handles that is more of a data center sustainability group, not the carbon group. They're focused on what they would call social license to operate. So they want not only to have a legal ability to run their facility, but they want to have very strong connections to the communities where they are, and they want measurable impacts. And so they funded a project in Des Moines, Iowa, that is, again, so illustrative of what urban forestry can do. It's not just planting trees. It's not just trees that generate carbon storage, energy savings, air quality, and stormwater. All of which is quantified, but it launched a workforce training program for underserved youth in Des Moines. It built in a community education program through the local science center, as well as the involvement of a youth shelter. So this is I would call it a quintuple bottom line project with so many benefits to it. So I'm just going to move on. Here's one slide, and then we'll talk a little about quantification. Richmond, Virginia. This is a 64-acre forested parcel, and it happens to have on it an African-American cemetery. The owners of the cemetery were not able economically to make that work. They had offers to log it, and a local foundation, the Enrichment Foundation, stepped up and said, we want to preserve this for all the many reasons that you would want to preserve a resource like this. Tremendous sociocultural importance of that site. The site was very degraded. The graves and tombstones were overgrown, were almost submerging in the greenery that was growing up around it because it was not cared for. And obviously a huge asset of 64 forested acres. And as it turns out, that is now the first UNESCO site in the US on the UNESCO slave route. So just a tremendous site. Now I mentioned that the volumes for urban forestry will be low, and that's true. Here's a quick slide that just describes 64 acres. The second bullet you'll see says CO2. It's about 5,400 issuable credits over 2 years. We then just did a gross revenue estimate, 54,000, 118,000 at 10 to 22 a ton. That pricing is very conservative, and much more to say on that. And then the co-benefits table is pasted in. You'll see here, if you start at the top left, you'll see rain interception, which is rainfall interception. That's the canopy interception of that stormwater. The resource unit is the cubic meters that are reduced by that rainfall interception. And then if you move over 2 columns, you'll see the total dollars of $20,000. That's the cost to treat those resource units of stormwater. And these are the co-benefits per year. And we don't have time to walk through the whole table here, but this includes air quality, energy savings. The stormwater reduction is the single largest avoided cost, dollar avoided cost, but that benefit is $33,000 per year. This is a preservation project, so they have to commit to at least 40 years. And by 40 years, these co-benefits will total 1.3 million. So again, this is one project, not the largest. There are much bigger projects we're working on, but this one I think has just partly that incredible story. So a quick section on what we might call the demand. Who are the buyers? Who are the funders? Well, we know the companies, all of them want quantified reportable values. We put together that first group of projects with different kinds of buyers. A public buyer in the form of the City of Austin, a social license to operate buyer in the form of Microsoft, carbon buyers in the form of Fisherman's Finest. And you all may know that the large established corporate carbon buyers, they generally transact their credits through one of the carbon portfolio advisory firms, kind of referred to as brokers. And so those carbon portfolio advisors are often competing with each other because they want to represent the companies and they want to transact the credits. Almost all of them are for-profit companies. And they are often looking for ways to differentiate their product from their competitors. And they have told me, and we are starting to see that they want to bundle portfolios of credits for their customers. They already do that in many ways, in that they will often build like a pyramid, and at the base of the pyramid are inexpensive but legitimate credits. And then they'll layer in more expensive credits, like, for example, the forest credits from Indonesia with the orangutan habitat, those more expensive, more charismatic credits. So the portfolio advisors are very interested in the urban credits because they view those as, again, the rare earth mineral, the low volume, very valuable, high price credits. That's the cherry on top of that portfolio. And that's the cherry that has the story that can be told. Now, one very quick slide on the impact certification. So one thing we learned in the course of this is that there are some projects that are wonderful. They're too small to be feasible for carbon crediting. or they have no money. They don't even have dollars to even start planting trees. And one example are the communities in the Florida Panhandle. Some of them lost 80% of their trees in Hurricane Michael. And when I talk to them now, they say, gosh, we were never really tree huggers. We always liked our trees. But now that we've lost them, we're having just a regular rainfall event, and it's like a flood because we've lost all the stormwater protections. So we hear these stories over and over. They don't have the money to do a carbon program. They don't have the resources. So we've developed an impact certification, and we will certify the design and the implementation of a project. The key innovation here is we've developed a project scorecard, and we have developed a whole rubric for scoring projects based on environment, on equity, and on health. And we used a very prominent urban forest research scientist in health, Dr. Kathy Wolf. And I think this also is another first ever tool where we have taken health and equity, and rather than just have urban forest people wave their hands and say, oh, we've done a project in an underserved neighborhood. No, let's be precise about that. Let's find out what the science-based impacts of that are. Social science is fine. And let's start putting that out. Let's identify those attributes. Let's identify what's science-based, and let's develop a list of impacts and a list of indicators for those impacts. Map those to the UN SDGs, and then have that all backed up by the citations to the scientific authority. So that is a whole second product that we have in addition to the carbon. Don't have time to talk about that, but could have a lot of potential for those smaller projects that are in desperate need of funding. Now, what could lie ahead? This is a slide where we just said, what if there were 50 cities? What if they took 20 neighborhoods and planted 250 trees in each of those 20 neighborhoods? What's the scale? And if you look at the total row here, you'll see that that would store about 500,000 tons of CO2. At a value of 20 a ton, that's almost $10 million. This slide is the co-benefits for the same kind of planning: 250 trees, 20 neighborhoods, 50 cities. You can go to the bottom line to see the avoided costs on that. That's 17 million. And those are the co-benefits per year after the trees reach a 25-year maturation. And then you remember that I mentioned that we are adding 100 million acres of urban land. Can we dream? Can we think, what if we preserved 1 million of those acres, 1% of those additional acres? And this is a very rough approximation, but if we take a carbon index of 100 tons per acre, that's 100 million tons of CO2. And the co-benefits, this is per year, are absolutely eye-popping on that. And if you look again, just to flow to the bottom line, that's 2.8, almost $3 billion of co-benefits per year. And then our last substantive slide, I call this version 2.0 because, what could lie ahead? Maybe one of you could do this. One idea is, let's create carbon districts in cities. And you all may know that municipal law has long, for many years in America, has created through state law, enabling law, the ability for municipalities to set up special districts. A lot of utilities are delivered through special districts, sewer districts, water districts, local improvement districts, even for repaving. Well, why not have a carbon district? And why not identify a district? And you could use many criteria to do that. It could be to close canopy. It could be for under-resourced community. It could be to deliver particular water benefits. Create a district, quantify the CO2 baseline in that district, put investments into that to either preserve or plant that district, and then wait for year 5, year 10. It's got to be enough time for the for the carbon to grow, and then you credit the delta between the baseline and the carbon stock at year 10. Could be a tremendous catalytic way to drive investment into opportunity zones. And I don't mean the current legal opportunity zones, but I mean canopy equity opportunity zones. The second bullet is on equity and health. American Forests is doing a tree equity mapping. And some other work is done. I think they're working with TNC on that. They are really trying to identify what might be called the equity gaps or the equity opportunity zones. And I had just talked very briefly about our impact certification. That is a project scale scoring. So the concept here is American Forests and its partners can map these equity zones. And if we can start delivering a score to those zones so that as projects start getting done in those zones, we can actually close the equity gap. That is another vision that would be wonderful to see come to fruition. Okay, well, we are coming to the end now, and I promised you a cordial, so you can sit back and put the napkin on the table. I hope you've enjoyed the meal so far. But I say a cordial here because it's easy to get lost in the quantified values and looking at trees as infrastructure. What we in urban forestry never want to forget, and we don't want other people to forget it, is that human beings have a connection to trees that is beyond their utility value. And you see that in the entire Native American ethos toward trees, which is to regard them almost as sacred objects to be treated with respect and stewardship. You see it in the Greco-Roman myths of groves that had their own spirits, the naiads who lived in particular groves. Humans have a special connection. My children who are a little older now, of course, love Lord of the Rings, and you're probably aware of the trees in that. Even Guardian of the Galaxy has Groot, who is a kind of a tree. Maybe not super articulate, but a wonderful character. So I'm going to stop now and just show you 5 slides that hopefully will be good for your hearts. All right, thank you very much for your attention, and that's the end of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Mark, for your talk, and what a nice way to end. Over the course of your presentation, we've had a number of questions come in from the audience. We'll now shift gears to Q&A, and we won't be able to address every single question in the time we have, but we'll try to cover a representative sample. So here's the first one I've got coming in from Emma. Emma asks, can you talk about measuring additionality and permanence in these projects? How might you respond to skeptics who argue that these projects are not additional or permanent?
Well, those are 2 very important issues. So we have 2 protocols. The preservation protocol requires a 40-year commitment to preserving the trees, which comports with the voluntary market. We also have a 100-year protocol that comports with the 100-year standards that are used in California. So permanence is not really an issue on that. The additionality, that's really measured by, are these trees at risk and are they being preserved? If they're at risk and if they're going to be cut down, then preservation of those trees is additional. And that's a key issue in any avoided conversion, avoided emission protocol. So we have that. We have 3 indicia for risk in our protocol. So that addresses the additionality in the preservation protocol. The planning protocol was a much more challenging issue. And on the permanent side, the quick rundown on that is when the protocol drafting group convened, I said to them, if we want to be in the compliance market, it's got to be 100 years. But a number of us had served on a protocol at the Climate Action Reserve, and it was clear to us and the 20 other members of that drafting group that a 100-year planning protocol no one will ever do that. So let's not waste our time on that. So then it was, okay, the general standard now for permanence is 40 years in the voluntary market. Can we do a 40-year protocol? And the general feeling on that was no. If we require people to wait 40 years to get credits and require a 40-year commitment, no one will do projects. So the choice then was, well, let's just not do a planning protocol, or let's see how we can solve this problem. And I don't want to say creatively, but I want to say let's not just give up. Let's look at this and turn it over. This is a challenge. And so we decided, well, first, we can have certain requirements. We can, for example, require that we can impose what is known as the legal requirements test. So if the trees are required to be planted by a law or an ordinance, then they can't get credited. And that's a very important provision because you particularly don't want private land developers who are required to plant trees to plant them and get credits for them. So that takes that whole issue off the table. And then we thought, if we issue credits that are known as forward credits or ex-ante credits, if we do that, how do we make sure that those are really reliable credits from a permanence, from an additionality point of view? So we looked at the research. Again, this is the whole group, scientists, and we saw that there's mortality data, so that as urban trees hit certain mortality mileposts, they have much higher survival rates. So we said, let's require sampling, and let's require projects to demonstrate their actual survival rates in the course of the project, and let's issue credits at those mileposts. And then last, we said, okay, those are still forward credits. Forward credits are frowned upon. How we want to look buyers in the eye, and we want to say, these are incredibly valuable credits. These are as good credits as any other credit you will get. So we explored a couple options. We talked to some timber companies about setting aside enough carbon stock to back up or collateralize all of the urban forest credits. They were interested, but the main impediment there is it's one thing to set aside a carbon stock, but that carbon stock has not been reduced to a credit. So there's a little bit of a gap there. So we finally just decided, you know what? We need to, for any buyer who wants, we need to back up the planting credit with a certified, verified credit from one of the three big registries. So we need to collateralize our credit with an inexpensive but legitimate credit that represents carbon already reduced from the atmosphere. So we have what is known as what we call a performance guarantee for the planting credits on the urban side. So a buyer in effect gets a verified credit, inexpensive but legitimate credit, and they also get all of the carbon from the urban forest project. So there's much more to say on that, but that's the medium length answer to that question.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. In that vein, extending Emma's question just a little bit more, how does city forest credits address the leakage issue?
Well, leakage is an issue that we felt that was a particularly significant issue in the preservation protocol. Because if you're preserving forested land in an urban area, there is the possibility that development that is displaced on that is just going to go to other sites. And those other sites will just cut down trees so that you're not getting any net gain. So that leakage issue in the preservation side was very important. Our forest carbon scientist did a lot of research on that, and we ended up essentially, and he sets out the methodology in the protocol. We essentially required all projects to take a displaced development deduction that actually is a deduction of about almost 20% off any creditable carbon. And again, the scientists can explain this better than I can as to how he reached that figure, but it is a significant deduction from projects. And again, we wanted to be very conservative, so that may be too great a deduction, because in many cities, even if you preserve a 20, 40, 200 acre parcel, there's usually places that don't have trees on them where that development can go. But we took a conservative approach and applied a kind of across the board, just under 20% deduction right off the top.
So summarizing your answer to each of those additionality, leakage, and permanence questions, I think what many of the audience members may be wondering is, like, how does your approach to those three key issues in crediting differ from the approaches taken by the three big registries and their protocols?
Well, so on the preservation side, I would say not all that different, in that we require, proof of risk of loss of the trees. We have 40 years and 100 years that comport with those permanent standards. We have a leakage provision that is more customized for urban forestry, but was put together by a very well-known, prominent forest carbon scientist. So we haven't had any issues with on the preservation protocol. On the planning protocol, those additionality, those permanence issues, those are real issues. And if we want to have urban forest carbon protocols, we needed to find a way to solve that. The simple, quick solution could be described as something that the other registries don't do, which is the performance guarantee credit. So we back up every urban forest credit with a legitimate credit that already represents a metric ton reduced, so the buyers get 2 tons of carbon for every ton they're buying. Now, that's not the big registries don't do that because they haven't had to find ways to, again, we feel strongly that these urban forest projects are valuable. We also feel very strongly that we want the planning protocol and our crediting process to be credible. So we weren't willing to just go to buyers or go out into the world with forward credits, even if they're at survival mileposts. That's great. Even if there's a legal requirement test, that wasn't enough. We said, no, we're going to back these up with a credit that already represents the atmospheric reduction.
Great. Thank you, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
So another question in a very different vein here, coming in from Mary. How can we arrange to talk about a program for city parks and riparian corridors in Hartford, Connecticut?
Well, that's a great question. We have a lot of material we could give you. We'd be happy to talk to you. I think you would want to look at some basic issues up front, like eligibility. And by eligibility, I mean, are you within city or town boundaries or the boundaries of the U.S. Census Bureau maps of urban areas? I think you'd want to look at where you have some opportunities for scale, because carbon crediting on the planting side, we're really not working with places that are planting fewer than 1,000 trees. So you have to have the stakeholders there and the capacity to do a larger scale project if it's a planting project. And then a key thing is going to be, who are the stakeholders? And what are the key institutions, organizations that would need to participate in that? I think you would also want to think that you would not want to think of this as, let's just do a one-off project. You can certainly do a project that's a pilot, but you want to see whether you have the possibility for a longer-term program. Because the program is where you will, over time, deliver the benefits. Those carbon revenues can loop back in to fund maintenance of trees. And the urban forest people are aware that planning is one thing. The maintenance dollars are very hard to get for urban forest trees. So the carbon credit revenues are a significant, potential source for those maintenance dollars. So those are just some things that occur to me kind of off the top of my head, but we'd be happy to talk to you, or we'd be happy to send you some of our standard toolkits and introductory materials.
Great, thank you, Mark. And I believe you have a lot of that online on your website, and we can help connect individual audience members afterwards if they're interested. So moving on to another question here from Matthew. In a similar vein, what is the net financial gain or yield for a local planting partner? And at what scale would the impact certification become more feasible than the planting protocol, and vice versa?
Well, that's a great question. So the financial impact of a carbon project is very much differs depending on what kind of project type it is. And so the preservation projects are kind of in a category all by themselves, because those are usually done as part of a whole conservation effort of some sort. And so the carbon revenues, in that case, on the preservation side, those, I encourage anyone who's thinking about a preservation project, again, to think of the carbon revenues as funding maintenance and stewardship. Because if you're acquiring urban land, the credit revenues are not enough to fund the acquisition of the land or the acquisition of the easement rights to protect the development. So I encourage people to think of the carbon credit revenues as maintenance dollars, stewardship dollars on the preservation side. Similarly, on the planting side, I always encourage people to think of it not as this is going to fund all of the costs to implement a project or a program. This will help fund maintenance dollars. Now, the exception to that is a place like Austin, and this could be done in other places, but in their riparian plantings, they are able to plant larger acreages, and they can plant it very efficiently, and they can plant it well, and they are planting in that case not with an eye toward a high survival rate. They are expecting a high mortality rate, but they're planting a whole palette of species there. So they have very small, they're going to create an understory, a midstory, and a canopy. So they have a lot of trees. They plant at tremendous density. They expect very high mortality, and they're creating essentially a forest ecosystem there in those riparian areas. Now, they can plant those cheaply, and they don't have a lot of maintenance dollars. So in that case, the carbon credit revenues for those, they're spread out over time because the credits are issued again at these mileposts. However, the carbon credit revenues from one whole project can fund almost the cost of that project, including the staff. So we're paying a lot of attention to that, because that's a model that will be particularly attractive. Although urban forest people, again, they're painfully aware that if they can get any revenue toward maintenance dollars, that's a critical factor both to their budgets and to the survival of the urban forest.
Great, thank you, Mark. A clarifying question here from David that refers to one of the answers you gave a few minutes ago. He asks, why isn't the 2-for-1 collateralized offer structure that you spoke of just another example of selling the same ton of carbon twice?
Well, they are paying what they're paying for the credit. They're getting 2 tons, but they can only record 1 of the tons. So, we will retire. Again, let me back up. This really depends on the buyer. And if the buyer wants the performance guarantee credit, that credit will get retired to their account. And if they regard the city forest credit as something additional to that, that they don't want to claim credit for, then they don't claim credit for it. So so they can, they can essentially retire the one credit, the performance guarantee credit, and not the city forest credit. But they could also retire both the credits, They're not buying one credit though, they're buying 2 credits. And they're paying far more money for the 2 credits than they could get for 2 cheap credits. So they're not buying 1 credit and getting credit for 2, they're buying 2 credits.
Great, thank you for that clarification. So another question here coming in from Matthew again. He asked a question that I think would be helpful for everyone to hear the answer to. He says, who identifies the buyers? The project, City Forest Carbon, or another party?
Well, so again, we're the registry, so we do not transact the carbon. We don't buy and sell the carbon. We do our best to help the local projects articulate the value of their credit. And we will connect them with buyers if we can. So in the case of King County, Fisherman's Finest came to us. We just referred them to the project operator. We do have relationships with the carbon brokers. So if there's a project coming up, we will call the carbon brokers and just put them in touch with local projects. We also have very good relations with Arbor Day Foundation. They have a carbon program with American Forests. So in many cases, they have, they both have large corporate client bases that we can help connect to local projects. The one area where we are less helpful is local buyers. Because, in Des Moines, Iowa, we're in Seattle, we have minimal ability to go help them find local buyers. So it's really the local buyers are really coming from the local urban forest people. We are doing our best to connect them with the larger national carbon buyers.
Great, thank you, Mark. A question in from Lizzie. She asked, how do you make the accreditation and monitoring affordable for cities? And in line with that, Katie asks, can you say more about the commitment a city should plan to make of staff time and other resources to realize a city forest carbon project above and beyond what it would take just to realize the preservation or planting project itself?
Yeah, so those are great questions. We have designed these projects to be as streamlined as possible, consistent, with having them still be highly reliable. And we knew from the start that if a city is contemplating a project, and if they're contemplating carbon credits on the project, you're going to have the cost of implementing the project apart from the carbon, and then you're going to have the cost of complying with the protocol and earning the credits. So we knew that the cost of complying with the protocol had to be less than the revenue they could expect from the carbon credits, because obviously they're not going to do projects if they're actually going to lose money off it. So the way that we help to streamline that is essentially on the quantification side, our scientists and our lead scientist on the urban side, on the planning side, led the science team that did the Urban Forest Protocol, the Climate Action Reserve, and did the protocol also for the state of California. The state of California adopted an Urban Forest Protocol in 2011. Neither that protocol nor the one at CAR has had any applicants to it. And that was one of the reasons we started our work. So he developed essentially spreadsheets where he had all the formulas, all the equations. He based the carbon off the Urban Tree Database, which is a huge technical manual published by the Forest Service. It has all the growth curves, crown height, leaf area, all the data important to urban trees in a huge database. He essentially developed spreadsheets so that local people can enter their species and their numbers. And then those spreadsheets work through, again, based on sampling and survival rates. Those spreadsheets will crank out the carbon and the co-benefit totals. So that right there was a tremendous step forward in terms of making this possible for local urban forest people to do. They don't have to go, find someone who's going to do plot sampling or is going to, somehow have to to take DBH and measure every tree and do elaborate calculations to get the carbon and the co-benefits. So on the quantification side, that's been a significant advance. On the monitoring side, the advantage we have in urban areas is those are flown over fairly often by the telemetry services who sell their work to Google Earth and places like that. Also, in contrast to forest projects where you're often, a day's journey away from the forest and where you're dealing with a huge, vast tract of forest land that's being credited, you can literally get in your car and drive up to the urban forest projects. So they're very close, and in many cases, after a certain number of years, the resolution is fine enough so you can image those projects and actually see the crowns of trees on them. So we've kept the monitoring costs down, again, partly just because we're here in these urban areas, so there's proximity and there's imaging. And we do require them on the planning side to submit an annual report, though. So they have to submit imaging or geocoded photos every year of the project.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. I think because many of our audience will need to move on to the rest of the obligations of their day, I'll provide a little wrap up here, and then we can stay on and do a few more questions that are outstanding if folks want to hang around. So I just want to thank you all again for joining our webinar today. To view a recording of this webinar, please visit the Events tab on the Yale Center for Business and the Environment website, or find our channel on YouTube. Thank you again for all joining us. Reminder, this is Charlie Governale here from the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, and we'll have a number of webinars upcoming on many other topics in conservation finance. So please do keep tabs on what's going on and join us for another one of these. So Mark, if you still have a few minutes, we can turn back to a few remaining questions from the audience here. Is that all right?
That's fine, sure.
So another question in here from Nick. He asks, it sounds as though the co-benefits outside of carbon actually make the economics pencil. Is calling it carbon plus intentional over using water or public health or another naming?
Well, that's a great question. Early on when we saw that we could bundle these co-benefits in with the carbon, I also asked, can we bundle in equity and health? Can we bundle in wildlife, bird, flyways? The answer was no. The science isn't really there yet to bundle that in a quantifiable way with the credit, but we can bundle those ecosystem benefits. So those numbers are significant on those, as you mentioned, Nick, and as you saw. We actually debated early on, should we just break those all out a la carte and let projects sell the carbon to a carbon buyer, the stormwater to all the many entities that have to meet stormwater regulations, sell the air quality to, a hospital, a healthcare, an insurance company that would value that, sell the heating and cooling to utilities. We debated that, but the problem with that is, again, we're small. We have to marshal our own resources carefully, and that would create a lot of moving parts. And we also weren't confident that to the extent there are markets for those co-benefits, that the buyers or funders of those would actually jump in and do this. For example, there are millions of dollars spent on stormwater, in America, but and those stormwater regulations are often delivered through, hard infrastructure. There's increasing use of like rain garden stuff, but in many places, even though the science on the tree reductions of stormwater is quite clear, in many cases the civil engineers haven't accepted that, and they're troubled by things like, yeah, but trees get cut down, and how do we keep track of that? So we weren't confident that there would be a clean, easy path from those co-benefits to the beneficiaries of those co-benefits. So for all those reasons, we decided let's definitely bundle in these co-benefits. Let's show these values, and let's use that as a way to support a higher price for the carbon. But the concept is the credits are going to be sold to carbon buyers for carbon, and the high price is partly justified, by all the things, the story, the media, the people, but partly justified by the incredible value of the quantified co-benefits. So it's an interesting issue, and we've debated that. If those other markets became stronger and clear, and if urban forestry was recognized in those markets as a clear impact that they can measure, we would consider breaking those out a la carte and selling those separately. But right now, we do not.
Great, thanks, Mark. And in that vein, you mentioned pricing. Another question from the audience: how do you decide the carbon price for each each project? Do both you and the buyer agree on the price? Do you use a different price depending on the category of the project? How does that process work? And I guess this is also kind of a broader question for those not familiar with carbon pricing in the voluntary market in general. If you could just give a quick overview of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, so number one, again, we're the registry, we're the credentialing body. So we don't set the market, we don't set the prices. So it's really, we issue the credits to the projects, and then the projects sell their credits to the buyers. So the city of Austin, for example, they negotiated their own price with the local tree organization nonprofit. It's an extremely high price, I will tell you, because they told me. But we did not set that price, and we didn't really have input into the price. King County sold their preservation credits also at a very high price. And that was just determined between King County and between there have been now 2 buyers for the credits there. So it's really set by the project. Now, we will talk to projects about what they may want to charge. We're happy to go through their project budgets, go through the cost to comply with the carbon protocol. We're happy to advise. We're happy to connect them to other urban forest people that have done projects. We obviously want projects to charge and to get a very high price. And we've encouraged them to be bold and, not try to compete on price with other credits, even high quality forest credits. And so here's a quick kind of word on the pricing. A carbon buyer can buy an inexpensive carbon credit for $1 to $3 a ton. And those would be, industrial gas, methane projects, some landfill projects. Then a high quality forest credit is going to be $8 to $15 a ton. And then the urban forest credits are well over that. If you really want to know, I welcome an email. I would probably put you in touch with King County or with Austin so they can talk to you about that. But they've been much higher than those prices. On the planting side in particular, we encourage people to charge a high price. The preservation projects, the bigger they are, the more they look like a forest project. So we have told them that it's likely their prices will get pulled down a little bit toward forest prices. But so far, at least, the preservation projects has still sold at a probably 50% higher than even the high quality forest credits.
Great, thank you, Mark. One other from Virginia. She asks, are you discounting the credits when you describe credits over time in the Austin project, covering upfront costs? I'm not sure which aspect of discounting Virginia is referring to, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit.
Well, I can explain what they've done there, which is the city of Austin has essentially agreed that we will buy credits as the credits are issued. And I don't know if the city has agreed to buy them at a fixed price through the whole project. And so in their case, they have a 25-year project commitment. The credits are issued at 4 intervals. And I don't know whether the city and the tree nonprofit agreed on just the price for the first issuance of credits or for all of them. it would make sense from the project point of view to not commit to selling all the credits for the same price through the whole project, because 25 years from now, these credits may be worth much more. So I'm not sure if that addresses your question, Virginia, but maybe the answer is I don't really know if the nonprofit there is discounting the credits or if they're just selling them as issued and that they will negotiate the price at each issuance date.
Great, thank you, Mark. One other question here from the audience. Could you clarify a bit more on the double credit? What ex post credits are you providing from the existing registry? And I think that was just a clarification when you had mentioned the collateralization, which credits are being used for collateral here.
Yeah, so because our credits are not entirely ex post, we do offer this performance guarantee, which is an ex post credit that has been issued by one of the big registries. So that's just something that if any buyer wants that, we will supply that. And so the buyer will get, in effect, two credits. One is the ex post credit that has already been third-party verified and issued. They will also get the city forest credit, which is also third-party verified and issued, but parts of that credit until the end of the project are ex ante credits. So they get one ex post credit that is a legitimate credit from one of the big registries. Well, it'll be from ACR or Vera, and then they get the city forest credit.
Great, thank you, Mark. So just as we wrap up here, wondering whether there's any kind of key takeaway or overarching conclusion that you want to leave the audience with.
Well, I would say, yeah, I guess the one thing I would say is that we started our work with an effort to, again, take the carbon world and put a new product into the mix. And you can hear from some of the questions about additionality and permanence, there's a strong desire to protect that existing carbon whole program that is underway and has been going for 20 years. And those issues that are raised are very important. We have, as I said, we've wanted our credits to be as credible as any other credit. And so on the planning side, the performance guarantee credit is designed for a buyer to get an ex post credit and, in effect, an ex ante city forest credit. And they are going to pay a huge premium for that. But again, we think that's justified by the value, particularly of the city trees. But I will say I'm starting to see lots of interest in regional crediting programs. And I'm not talking about our organization. I'm talking about like the San Diego Foundation, which is starting to explore a way to take crediting down to a more regional level. And I think there has been some dissatisfaction with the carbon world as it is set up now. And I've heard some people tell me what's like a priesthood. You know, they've got all these rules and regulations and they're guarding it very carefully and they don't want any new players in this. And whether that's true or not, I don't have opinions on. But there's this interest in local people kind of taking back the crediting so that they can develop a way to credit local projects that could be a diverse array of projects. I mean, some of the people in central Iowa are just starting to talk about this, where they would want to credit some phosphorus reduction projects. You know, they have a lot of runoff into water. They have a lot of agricultural land, and they have a lot of runoff issues. So they want to set up a way to have different project types that may produce different climate sustainability benefits beyond carbon even, and then connect those with local buyers. And the local buyers would be local companies, but the local companies now, they don't really know how to invest in these kind of projects. There's no easy way for them to find a good project that is vetted and is legitimate that they can invest in. And so I think they have all found us because a core part of what we're doing is to try to focus on that, local crediting. And as you know, we are fitting ourselves into the carbon world. The impact certification is a recognition, though, that there are a lot of valuable projects that can't fit within the elaborate, rules and requirements of the carbon world. But let's not ignore that group. Let's put together the tools so that they can demonstrate in a reportable, science-based way their impacts. And then let's set up a platform where local companies can find those projects. They're there, they're vetted, they're certified, and they can put money into those. So that's a very interesting kind of in the future to think about how this could work at a regional level with a lot of local control and reflecting local circumstances, local climate issues, local challenges, something that is delivered more locally rather than a big registry where the protocols are mostly drafted by the registry and by the carbon developers who are going to develop the projects. So that's not really about our work, but it's again kind of a look in the future. And it's a look that I think is inquiring increasing urgency as, again, COVID-19 takes our attention off the climate a lot and probably for very good reasons, but the climate issues are only going to get worse. And we've got to find more ways to deal with this, I think, than just one particular way of carbon crediting. So the regional crediting is a very interesting idea, and I think there are a lot of possibilities in that also. So that's my quick takeaway, Charlie.
All right. Thank you so much, Mark. Again, to the audience, thank you all for joining us. Until next time, this is Charlie Gavernale from the Yale Center for Business and the Environment.